90,000 soldiers. And the man they were sent to kill had only just found out they were coming. It is late July, 634 AD, and the Eastern Roman Empire, wounded, humiliated, still processing the loss of Syria's southern frontier, has finally stopped trying to respond to Khalid ibn al-Walid's campaign piece by piece. Emperor Heraclius, one of the finest military minds the Byzantine world ever produced, has looked at the strategic map and identified the one moment, the one configuration of forces that gives Rome a chance to end this before it becomes something that cannot be ended. Right now, Khalid's forces are spread. His main army is in the northeast near Bosra. The legendary commander, Amr ibn al-As, is far to the south, operating near the valley of Araba, separated from Khalid by hundreds of miles of open country. Between them, nothing. No fortified cities. No reinforcing columns. Just desert. Heraclius is going to drive 90,000 soldiers into that gap and destroy the Muslim armies one by one before they can unite. It is the correct plan. It is exactly what Khalid himself would do. And if it works, the Islamic conquest of Syria ends here, in the rolling plains of Palestine, before it has truly begun. What Heraclius does not know is that the fastest riders in the desert are already galloping south with Khalid's orders. He does not know that a concentration march is beginning that will cover impossible distances in impossible time. He does not know that the trap he has spent weeks building is about to be turned against him. He does not know. Yet. What Khalid ibn al-Walid does when the situation looks worst. To understand the scale of what Heraclius assembled at Ajnadain, you need to understand what the Byzantine Empire had just been through and what it was willing to do to prevent another catastrophe. Heraclius was not a palace emperor who had inherited his throne and his title together. He was a soldier who had fought his way to power, who had personally led the Roman legions in a decade-long war against the Sassanid Persian Empire that had nearly destroyed both civilizations. He had won that war. He had driven the Persians back from Egypt and Syria and Anatolia, recovered the true cross from Persian hands, and returned to Constantinople as the most celebrated emperor in a century. Then, almost immediately, the Muslim armies emerged from Arabia. At first, the dispatches from the southern frontier had seemed manageable. Desert tribes, local unrest, the kind of raiding that border garrisons handled routinely. But the reports kept coming, and the pattern they described was not raiding. It was conquest. The Ghassanid allied army, which had served Rome as its buffer against the desert for generations, had been destroyed at Marj Rahit. A force had crossed what Roman geographers called the Land of Death, the waterless Syrian desert, in a march that the Romans had considered physically impossible. Bosra, the heavily fortified capital of Arabia, had fallen. And at the center of every report was the same name, Khalid ibn al-Walid. Heraclius read those reports the way a doctor reads a diagnosis he already suspects, and he understood what the symptoms meant. This was not a tribal incursion. This was a strategic invasion led by a commander of the First Order. If he allowed it to continue at its current pace, Syria would be gone before he could concentrate enough force to stop it. He issued emergency decrees to every province that still answered to Constantinople. Veteran legions came from Armenia. Heavy infantry marched from Anatolia. Christian Arab auxiliaries mobilized from the northern Levant. The concentration point was a location in southwestern Palestine called Ajnadain, between Jerusalem and the Mediterranean coast. Chosen with precise strategic intent, it sat exactly where it needed to sit to drive between Khalid in the northeast and Amr in the south. When the assembly was complete, 90,000 soldiers stood at Ajnadain under the command of General Warden, supported by Heraclius's own brother, Theodoros. 90,000. The largest force Rome had concentrated against the Muslim armies since the conquests began. Khalid's intelligence network found the buildup before it was finished. The web of local informants and fast-riding scouts that he had maintained across Syria and Palestine was one of the least celebrated but most consequential elements of his command. Other generals relied on intelligence when it arrived. Khalid had built systems to make it arrive faster. When the first reports of the Roman concentration at Ajnadain reached him at Bozrah, they were detailed enough for him to understand immediately what Heraclius was doing. He saw the trap with complete clarity. He saw its elegance. He also saw the single thing that could prevent it from closing: speed. If Khalid remained at Basra consolidating his recent conquests, the rational choice, the safe choice, the choice that every conventional military logic recommended, Wardan's 90,000 would march south and destroy Amr ibn al-As before Khalid could intervene. Once Amr was gone, the Romans would turn north with their full weight, and the fragmented Muslim forces would be crushed one by one. It was defeat in detail, the oldest and most effective strategy in warfare, and Heraclius had deployed it with the precision of a man who understood exactly what he was doing. The only counter was concentration. Unite before the Romans could separate. March faster than the Romans believed an army could march. Khalid's orders went out to every Muslim commander in Syria simultaneously. Break off all current operations. Leave nothing behind that cannot be abandoned. March at once to Ajnadain. He sent the fastest riders the desert produced south to the valley of Araba, where Amr's forces were operating. He sent word west to Yazid ibn Abi Sufyan. The orders carried one message: abandon everything. March now. The Romans are moving. Then he broke camp at Basra and turned his own force southwest into the blazing Syrian summer. The march of the Muslim army from Bozrah to Ajnadain was something the Roman Empire had no framework for understanding. When a Byzantine legion marched, it was a military column supported by a massive, slow-moving baggage train. Heavy wooden wagons carrying supplies, artillery, spare equipment, the administrative apparatus of a professional imperial army that had been fed and supplied from permanent bases for centuries. The column moved at the speed of its slowest wagon. It required roads. It required supply depots. It required the entire logistical infrastructure of an empire to function. The Muslim army was a moving nation. As Khalid's forces broke camp, they did not leave their families behind in fortified cities, because they had no fortified cities. They traveled with their wives, their children, their elderly relatives. They drove vast herds of sheep, goats, and camels that served as their mobile food supply, a living logistics system that required no roads, no depots, no fixed infrastructure. They were entirely self-sufficient. They could sustain a march that would have exhausted a Byzantine supply chain within a week. The women of the Muslim army were not spectators in this movement. They managed the complex logistics of relocating a camp that numbered in the thousands. They organized the water supplies. They tended to the wounded from previous engagement. They kept the herds moving, the children fed, the camp functional during a march that pushed horses and camels to the edge of what they could sustain. And if the camp was ever threatened, if Roman cavalry broke through the fighting lines, or if raiders reached the rear, the women of the Sahaba were armed and prepared to fight. Roman historians who later documented this campaign recorded their disbelief at what they had encountered women at the rear of the Muslim army who had armed themselves with tent poles, with captured swords, with stones, and who had been instructed by Khalid personally that any Muslim warrior who broke from the line and tried to flee was to be struck down by them. Any Roman who broke through was to be met with resistance. There was no retreat. The camp itself was a wall. The dust of the Muslim migration rose high into the Syrian sky as the army pushed toward Ajnadain, racing against the Roman timetable, racing against the mathematics of 90,000 soldiers and the distance between Khalid and Amr. In the final days of July, the vanguard of Khalid's army crested the hills above the rolling plains of Ajnadain and stopped. From the south, a dust cloud appeared on the horizon. It was Amr ibn al-As, arriving with his veteran corps, having successfully evaded the Roman blockade that was supposed to prevent exactly this rendezvous. Shortly after, Yazid's forces appeared from the north. The concentration that Heraclius had designed his entire campaign to prevent had happened anyway. The reunion was a moment of relief so profound that men who had been marching for days without adequate sleep wept when they saw each other. The commanders embraced. The soldiers chanted the takbir across the hills of Palestine, their voices carrying across ground that had not heard an Arabic war chant before and would not stop hearing one for centuries afterward. For the first time in the history of the Islamic conquests in Syria, the entire Muslim military force was concentrated on a single battlefield. Khalid ibn al-Walid commanded a unified army of approximately 32,000 men, battle-hardened veterans who had shattered Persian armies in Iraq, crossed the Syrian desert, and broken the fortifications of Basra. Then the commanders rode to the crest of the hills and looked at what was waiting for them, and the cheering died. Stretching across the plains below, consuming the landscape to the horizon in every direction, was the camp of the Imperial Roman army. Tens of thousands of tents in perfect geometric grids, laid out with a flawless engineering discipline that Byzantine military architects had refined over centuries. The banners of dozens of legions snapped in the wind. The sunlight reflected off a sea of iron scale armor, bronze helmets, and thousands upon thousands of heavy spear tips. 90,000 soldiers, nearly 3-to-1. Khalid looked at the numbers, and he did not change his expression. The night before Ajnadain was a study in contrasts that the chroniclers who recorded it seemed unable to resist describing in detail, because the difference between the two camps was not merely military, it was civilizational. In the Roman camp, fires burned bright along precise, organized lines. Armorsmiths sharpened weapons and repaired equipment with the methodical competence of professionals who had done this before every battle for their entire careers. Veteran legionaries who had survived the Persian War and the brutal campaigns of Heraclius's reign drank and boasted and argued about the morning with the comfortable confidence of men who were accustomed to being on the winning side. General Warden and Theodoros reviewed their battle formations in an opulent command tent, their planning conducted with the assurance of commanders who believed the mathematics of the situation made the outcome essentially predetermined. 90,000 against 32,000 on open ground, with heavy cavalry, elite archers, and the finest heavy infantry in the world. The outcome was not complicated. Across the dark plain, the Muslim camp was quiet. Not the quiet of fear, the quiet of men in prayer. Khalid spent the night riding through his camp without announcement, moving from group to group in the darkness, checking positions, checking equipment, checking the faces of his commanders. He did not give speeches. He asked questions and listened to the answers. And the picture those answers built told him what the morning would need from him. He assigned his commanders to their positions with specific instructions. Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah would hold the center. Yazid would command the powerful left wing. Amr ibn al-As would command the right. Khalid himself would take command of a mobile elite reserve, a force held back from the main line, positioned to move wherever the battle required. to plug gaps or exploit openings with the speed that had defined every victory he had ever won. Then he gave the order that would govern the entire first phase of the battle. One order. Absolute, non-negotiable. No one initiates the attack until I give the command. You hold the line. Whatever happens, you hold the line. Before the Roman horns sounded, General Warden sent a message. It arrived in the form of an old, heavily decorated Christian bishop riding a mule across the dusty no-man's land between the armies, accompanied by an escort, demanding to speak to the Muslim commander. The Roman strategy was transparent and deliberate. Warden believed, as most Byzantine commanders believed, that the Arabs facing them were desperate desert nomads driven from their homeland by poverty, and that the sight of 90,000 professional soldiers was enough to make that desperation negotiable. Khalid rode out to meet him. The visual contrast was the kind that storytellers remember, because it captured something true about the two sides. The bishop was draped in expensive silk and gold ornamentation, representing the immense, accumulated wealth of an empire that had been taxing the Mediterranean world for 4 centuries. Khalid wore the dust-caked clothes of a man who had been marching for days through the Syrian summer without stopping to change them. The bishop looked at him with what the sources describe as thinly veiled contempt, which suggests he was not trying very hard to veil it. We know that poverty and hunger have driven you from your lands. The bishop began. You see the army before you. It is countless. You cannot possibly win. But Emperor Heraclius is merciful. If you turn back now and leave Roman lands forever, he will give every one of your soldiers a gold dinar, a cloak, and a turban. To your commander, he will give 10 dinars. Khalid sat completely still on his horse and let the offer finish. He understood exactly what this was. It was not generosity. It was a psychological operation designed to introduce doubt into the Muslim ranks before a sword was drawn to plant the idea that the Romans were offering a way out, that survival was available at a price, that the choice between the offer and the battle lines behind Warden was a choice any rational man would find easy. Khalid leaned forward. "It is not hunger that brought us here," he said, his voice flat and unhurried. "We are a people who drink blood, and we have heard that there is no blood sweeter than Roman blood. That is why we are here." The bishop turned pale and rode back to the Roman lines at a speed that suggested he had stopped worrying about his dignity. The Roman war horn shattered the morning silence across the entire width of the plain, and what followed was not yet a battle. It was a demonstration of what a professional imperial army does before a battle, the systematic application of ranged fire at a scale that most armies never encountered and were not psychologically prepared to survive. Wardan ordered his archers forward. Tens of thousands of Roman archers stepped out from behind the heavy infantry wall and advanced to their firing positions. They were not the light skirmishers that many armies of the period fielded. These were trained, professional, composite bow archers from Armenia and Anatolia who had spent years developing the strength and technique to drive iron-tipped arrows through shield wood at sustained rates of fire. They knocked, aimed high into the morning sky, and released, and released, and released again. The sky above the Muslim lines darkened. That detail recurs in multiple sources, with such consistency that historians take it as a genuine observation. The density of arrows in the air above Ajnadain was sufficient that men looking up could see the light block. The sound of thousands of arrows in flight is described by ancient sources as a whistling that became a roar. And then the impact, the catastrophic, relentless drumming of iron hitting wood, tearing through leather, finding flesh. Men began to fall. The screaming of the wounded is a sound that cuts through the formal language of medieval chronicles and appears in sources that are otherwise restrained, because it is the kind of sound that witnesses do not forget. The younger Muslim warriors, bleeding, watching their brothers fall around them, looked to their commanders and begged for the order to charge to close the distance, to end the arrow storm by getting inside it, to do something, anything. Rather than stand and absorb punishment without responding, Khalid rode behind the lines, completely exposed to the same fire that was killing his soldiers. And he shouted the same order again and again until his voice was the only sound some men could hear above the storm. Hold your ground. Protect yourselves with your shields. Do not attack. For over an hour, the Muslim lines stood. In his command tent, General Wardan watched the Muslim formation through the dust and the arrow haze, and he was baffled. Every tribal army he had ever encountered had one of two responses to sustained massed archery. Either the formation broke and fled, or it broke and charged blindly forward in a rage that sent its soldiers running into the teeth of the Roman heavy infantry in disorganized groups that were easy to destroy. Both responses served the Roman strategy. Both responses were what Wardan's tactical plan was built around producing. The Muslim line was doing neither. It was bleeding. It was taking casualties at a rate that, sustained over an hour of concentrated archery, should have been catastrophic for morale. And it was standing. Perfectly, stubbornly, infuriatingly intact. Wardan made the decision that the situation appeared to demand. The archers had done their work. Now the heavy infantry would finish it. The Roman war horns sounded a second time, lower and longer than the first, carrying across the entire length of the battle line. The massive wall of Byzantine heavy infantry, the skutitoi, soldiers carrying interlocking heavy wooden shields rimmed with iron, backed by rank upon rank of Armenian and Anatolian spearmen, began to advance. 90,000 men moving forward at the pace of a deliberate grind, their heavy boots striking the plain in the synchronized rhythm of professional soldiers who had drilled this movement until it was as automatic as breathing. The earth shook. The dust rose. The wall of iron and wood and flesh moved toward the Muslim line with the remorseless quality of something geological rather than human. 200 yards. 100 yards. 50 yards. In the center of the Muslim formation, Khalid watched the Roman line close and said nothing. He was counting something: distance, time. The specific moment at which the Roman infantry would be committed enough that a counterstroke would hit them at maximum vulnerability. At 50 yards, he drew his sword. He raised it into the Syrian sun, and it caught the light. And every Muslim soldier who could see him saw it. He breathed once. He said the words, Allahu Akbar. What happened after that war cry crossed the plains of Ajnadain, the actual mechanics of the collision, the hours of fighting that followed, the specific moment when the battle turned, the fate of the individual commanders on both sides requires a second episode to tell properly. And that episode will be told. But what the first day of Ajnadain had already established, before the first sword crossed a sword, was something more important than any tactical outcome. The Romans had done everything correctly up to that moment. Heraclius had identified the strategic opportunity with precision. Wardan had assembled and deployed a force that should have been overwhelming by any rational military calculation. The bishop's embassy had been a reasonable attempt at psychological preparation. The arrow barrage had been executed with the professional competence of an army that had done it 1,000 times. And the Muslim army had absorbed all of it and was still standing. Formation intact. Commanders in position. Discipline unbroken. Waiting for the order. The Romans had expected poverty and desperation. They had found something they did not have a name for yet, a force whose cohesion came from a source that the mathematics of 90,000 versus 32,000 did not account for and could not calculate. Behind the Muslim battle line, the women of the Sahaba stood with their weapons and their orders, and no Muslim soldier who saw them could have doubted what the word retreat meant in this army. There was no retreat. There was only the sword raised in the sun, and the words that followed it, and the ground between two armies that had just run out. The Battle of Ajnadain, in its complete form, is one of the most consequential engagements in the history of the early Islamic conquests, and understanding its full significance requires placing it in the chain of events that it interrupted and then resumed. Heraclius's defeat in detail strategy at Ajnadain, the plan to drive 90,000 soldiers between Khalid and Amr before they could concentrate, was not a desperate gamble. It was the correct strategic response to the Muslim campaign in Syria, executed by one of the finest military planners of the 7th century with the full resources of the Byzantine Empire behind it. If Khalid had remained at Bozrah, if Amr had been destroyed in the south before the concentration happened, if the riders Khalid sent south with his orders had arrived even a day later than they did, any of those things, and the history of the Levant runs through a completely different channel. The concentration march from Basra to Ajnadain, crossing hundreds of miles of Syrian summer in days, with an army that moved like a nation rather than a military column, is the decision that made everything else possible. It is the moment that demonstrates what made Khalid ibn al-Walid different from the commanders he faced, not just in his tactical decisions on the battlefield, but in his ability to read a strategic situation and respond to it before the situation finished forming. Heraclius built a perfect trap. Khalid saw it being built and arrived at the trap site before the trap was closed. That is a different order of military intelligence than anything the Roman commanders at Ajnadain were prepared to counter. The broader consequences of Ajnadain reshaped the Middle East in ways that are still visible in the political consequences, linguistic, and religious geography of the region today. The Battle of Ajnadain was fought in July 634 AD. By 636 AD, the Byzantine catastrophe at Yarmouk had driven Rome from the Levant permanently. By 638 AD, Jerusalem had surrendered to Caliph Umar in person. By 641 AD, Alexandria had fallen. And Egypt, the province that had supplied Constantinople with grain for 6 centuries, was under Muslim control. The chain that runs from Khalid's concentration march at Ajnadain to the permanent transformation of the Eastern Mediterranean world is not unbroken. There were many battles, many commanders, many decisions along the way, but Ajnadain is the hinge. It is the moment when the Muslim conquest of Syria stopped being something that Heraclius' strategy might still have contained and became something that could only be responded to after the fact. Khalid ibn al-Walid was recalled from command before the full consequences of Ajnadain had unfolded. Removed not by military defeat, but by Caliph Umar's concern that soldiers were attributing victories to Khalid personally rather than to God. The sword of Allah became a private soldier under his own replacement and continued fighting without command or credit until he died in bed in 642 AD. Reportedly weeping that he had not been permitted to die as a martyr in the battles he had spent his life fighting. He is buried in Homs in modern Syria, the region his campaigns helped bring into the world that came after the Roman one. The plains of Ajnadain in southwestern Palestine are quiet today. The site sits in the modern Israeli-Palestinian landscape, an ordinary piece of geography that gives no obvious sign of what it witnessed in the summer of 634. The dust still blows across the same rolling ground. The hills where the Muslim army crested and saw the Roman camp for the first time are still there. What is gone is the world that was being contested on those plains, the Byzantine provincial order that had organized the Levant for 3 centuries, the Roman administrative and tax infrastructure, the Greek-speaking urban culture of Syrian cities that had existed since Alexander's time. All of it transformed, within a generation of Ajnadain, into something that would persist in its broad outlines for the next 14 centuries. The specific moment this script describes the bishop on his mule crossing the no man's land with his insulting offer, Khalid's reply about drinking blood, the arrow storm that bent but did not break the Muslim line, the sword raised into the Syrian sun, is the kind of history that textbooks reduce to a sentence and documentaries skip past to get to the outcome. But the outcome was made in those moments. It was made by Khalid's decision to abandon Basra and march. It was made by the riders who carried his orders south fast enough to reach Amr in time. It was made by 32,000 men standing under an hour of arrow fire and refusing to break. It was made by a general who held his sword high at 50 yards and waited until the exact second when raising it would matter most. History is made in specific moments by specific people making specific choices. Ajnadain is one of the clearest examples that the medieval world produced of how much a single correct decision, made at the right moment by someone capable of seeing what the situation required, can determine what comes after it for 1,000 years. If you made it to the end of the story, and if the image of 32,000 men standing under a darkened sky of arrows while their general rode behind them shouting, "Hold the line," is the kind of history that moves you, then you are exactly where you belong. Battle Archive exists for stories like this one. The commanders who saw the trap before it closed. The armies that absorbed the impossible and kept standing. The decisions made in late July heat on a Palestinian plain that changed the shape of the world. Subscribe. Hit the bell. Share this with someone who thinks they know the early Islamic conquests. Because I promise you, they have never heard Ajnadain told like this. The conclusion of the battle is coming. Durar ibn al-Azwar's rampage through the Roman lines, the Roman assassination plot against Khalid himself, and the total destruction of Wardan's 90,000, and it is every bit as extraordinary as what came before it. We will see you in the next battle.